Hello. We are back with another episode in Pursuing the Prize, and we're looking still at what pertains to the kingdom of God, and specifically looking at a topic that will take us through about 4 weeks here, entitled The King of the Kingdom. We're going to be evaluating what it means for there to be a king over the kingdom, and we've already considered in detail about the promises related to the kingdom, although we have yet to consider the promises of the king that would reign over that kingdom. But I think that we've already noticed many things about the kingdom so far that should enlighten us to the fact that God did intend for there to be a new kingdom, for there to be a new covenant, and for this kingdom to be superior to what came before it. That is not to say that Israel was not in its own sense glorious. That was not to say that God did something wrong there or failed because of Israel. But that is to say that they were a means to an end and not the end in and of themselves. There was something else coming, and Israel and the things that they faced were intended to be lessons for those that would come later. But all that being said, we must consider in detail about the king that reigns over this kingdom. We talk in great detail at times about how the leaders of a nation end up dictating in many ways the behavior of the people in that nation. The king makes a great difference over the type of people who are in that kingdom. If the king is righteous, then generally speaking the people are righteous. That's not always the case, of course, because everyone has choice. They have things they must decide on a day-to-day basis. And just because the king is right does not mean everybody else will be right automatically. But that is to say that generally speaking, that is what we'll discover, because people are followers and they want to be led by someone that they know is doing the right thing, or that they at least feel is doing the right thing. That can also cause problems in some capacities, but generally speaking, in a context where the ruler is genuinely righteous, that can produce good results. But of course, the opposite is also true. If the king is evil, if the king is a wicked person, if the ruler is a wicked person, if the rulers collectively over a nation are wicked people, then what are we going to expect from the people themselves, from the followers? Well, they too will be evil. So we must understand that the king that reigns over the kingdom is of great consequence and is important for us to understand. And we need to realize as well that in addition to the promises we've already evaluated about the kingdom, that God has also made some promises about the king that would reign over this coming kingdom. Now we realize that in the history of Israel, they did not have very many good kings. You can really count on one hand how many good kings Israel had, that is, the northern kingdom, and really even when we label them as good kings, they're only good in one area or another. It's not as though they were righteous people or moral people in any capacity. It's really only in one specific area they did something right that pleased God. In Judah, you can find a little bit more, people like Hezekiah and Josiah that were genuinely righteous and tried to do what was right, but even there you find failure. Even there you find sin. And these things are not pleasing before the Lord. These are not the things that he desires. So you do not find a good history there about kings and the righteousness they had, which was often fleeting. So we find failure in those capacities. We find problems in those situations. And so God envisions something greater. He envisions something and someone that would be better than all of that. We must first go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we find here a promise that is made to King David. And that promise that God makes to King David here regards David's desire to build him a house. And you remember that David had it in his heart that he would build a temple for the Lord. He makes a statement at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 7 that basically says that while David is living in a home, he's living in his own house that he's built, the tabernacle of God is out there in a tent. And he felt like that was an injustice because he had a heart for the Lord and for his service. He wanted and desired to bring that ark into a permanent structure, to bring that into a temple. He didn't have it in his heart to build it like the nations, although we might say in some ways it was built somewhat to the pattern that the nations had around them, but that was not necessarily a bad thing. But that is to say, that's not why David had that thought. It's not as though he saw his neighbors doing it and thought they should do the same thing, but he had this idea again at the beginning of chapter 7 that he wanted to glorify God through this avenue. And so he has this an idea in his heart. The prophet Nathan at first says that you should do this because the Lord is with you in all your ways. But then in verse 4 of 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Lord tells him directly, actually, no, David is not the one to do this. So let's go ahead and consider for a moment here what God actually has to say about this regarding David and regarding his promise to David about his kingdom and his throne specifically. So join me in the reading here you see on your screen beginning in 2 Samuel chapter 7. We're going to start in verse 8 and read down to verse 17 together here. Now therefore, thus shall you say to my servant David, Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the sheepfold, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and have made you a great name, like the name of the great men who are on the earth. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own and move no more, nor shall the sons of wickedness oppress them any more, as previously, since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused you to rest from all your enemies. Also the Lord tells you that he will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled, and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. What a beautiful promise. So we find, again, David's desire is to build the Lord a house, and the Lord tells him, actually, no, I'm going to build you a house. And what's going to happen is that the son that comes after you, Solomon in this particular immediate context, would be the one that would build that house, that temple structure. And we find that fulfilled in the book of 1 Kings chapter 8 specifically, as well as 2 Chronicles. So we find there is a partial fulfillment of this, but clearly there's something more in mind. There is the idea of the throne being established forever. There's a lasting, enduring nature to David's throne. And you will find all throughout the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and even into Chronicles that the measuring stick, as it were, of each king in Judah is David. He was a lamp of Israel. He was seen as the epitome of what it means to be a godly king. And now David was not a perfect man. It's not long after this chapter here in chapter 7 that David does some pretty horrible things. But that is to say that David had a heart for the Lord. He had a heart for service. He did the best that he could in his situation despite his setbacks and his own personal failures. So we find there that the Lord has something greater in mind. He has something more in mind that goes beyond David and goes beyond Solomon and goes even beyond all the kings we read about in the Old Testament. There is something lasting here, something enduring, a king that will come, who will reign on this throne forever and ever, and who would be established forever and ever, that would not be taken away, as the other kings had been. So that promise provides us the bedrock for what will come later. It is about David's throne. It is about the power of David's throne. It is about the symbolism of David's throne. It is the expectation of his throne and the king that would reign on it. We find a similar thought expressed to us in Psalm 110. So in Psalm 110, we find here in the first verse that this is a psalm that David has written. And he's written this and says in Psalm 110 and verse 1, we read together, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." So here, David says he has a Lord. Now remember, David is king over Israel. If you look at it from the perspective of a hierarchy, who would be over David? There really wouldn't be anybody. However, in this case, he says he has a Lord. There is someone who is greater than David, who would come after him, that would reign on his throne, who would actually reign at the right hand of God. And if we go through the psalm, we find some other allusions to what this type of king would be and what he would do. The Lord shall send, in verse 2, the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power, and the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. You have the dew of your youth. Here's what verse 4 says. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And we could go on in this psalm talking about the nature of this king and what he would accomplish and who he would be. But verse 4 clues us into something very significant, that this king would not just be a king, but also a priest. And that was simply impossible in the nation of Israel. You could not be a king and a priest simultaneously. If you'd like to read more commentary on that, just read 2 Chronicles chapter 26 about King Uzziah. Sometimes in many translations his name is Ahaziah. But he tried to be a priest and a king, and it didn't work out well for him. You cannot have both roles in the kingdom of Israel. This is speaking of something that would come later. This is speaking of something greater than what Israel had. This is a king that is better than even David is. And if David is the measuring stick for all kings, then what does that tell you about the one who is greater than him and whom he calls his Lord in Psalm 110 and verse 1? But we're not done. Let's go over to Ezekiel chapter 34 together. In Ezekiel chapter 34, we have a long discussion about the evils of the rulers of Israel at the time of Ezekiel, how they were horrible shepherds. They had sought to devour the flock and to kill the flock and use them for their own gain, and had really trounced over God's work. But here's what God says in Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 23 through 24, about what he is going to do, the type of leader he is going to establish over his people, the king that would right the wrongs of the past. So here's what Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 23 through 24 has to say. I will establish one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them. Notice this. My servant David. Keep in mind, David was long dead by this point. He was in the ground. He was buried. He was not going to be brought back for this purpose to serve as king once more. He was gone. But let's continue reading. He shall feed them and be their shepherd, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. We could obviously mention many other prophecies within this same context about the king that was coming that would be like David, but this one really cements in our minds the fact that God had in his heart and in his mind that the coming king would be like David. He would embody the traits of David in many respects in terms of his type of character and the heart that he had to serve God. This is the type of person who would lead his people, that would faithfully shepherd the flock that had been mistreated and abused in the past, that the shepherds they had previously were worthless. They were going to be cast out. But then God says, I'm going to raise up a righteous shepherd to them, a shepherd that will help them, a servant that will be among them, that will lead them in the right direction, and he is going to be the one that will feed my sheep and shepherd them to the places they need to go. So clearly we're getting a picture here of what this would look like. This is going to be a glorious king, a great king, a king like unto David, but a king that is greater than even David ever could be. But let's continue on and see who is going to be the one that fulfills these promises. Who could possibly measure up to this? Who could possibly fulfill these lofty promises? Well, that brings us to the New Testament. Hundreds of years after David, after he was long gone, we find that God did indeed fulfill his promise. And it's going to take us to Luke chapter 1, and we're going to begin in verse 26. We're going to find that the king that God promised and the king that God sent was unexpected by the people. He was not the person they would have ever have thought in a million years would be the one that God would send. But he was the king nonetheless. And his glory, his power, his dominion was all that God promised it would be, and then some. So let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 1 here. And let's read verse 26 all the way down to verse 36, or verse 33 rather, together. So verse 26 to verse 33 together here of Luke chapter 1. Now in the 6th month the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And having come in, the angel said to her, Rejoice, highly favored one, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women. But when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and considered what manner of greeting this was. Then the angel said to her, Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. We find here, in a very brief passage, the fulfillment of all the promises we just read from 2 Samuel, from Psalm 110, and from Ezekiel. The son that Mary was going to bear was going to be king. He is going to be reigning over God's people. He's going to be reigning on the throne of his father David. But notice also what it says there in verse 32. He will be what? Great in power, in dominion, in morals, and all the things. He's going to be excellent in every possible capacity. He is going to be called the Son of the Highest. Now there was a sense in the Old Testament that, in the Psalms at least, you will find that the kings are sometimes referred to in these terms. But this is going to take on a different form. This is going to be far greater than any of those kings ever could have been. He will be a son of God, or the Son of God, in a very special sense. That is not going to be revealed in the fullness in this passage, but we would find that much later. There's also something I'd like to mention about the name Jesus itself here that we find from Matthew chapter 1 and verse 21 that I have on the slide here. We notice that that name literally means the Lord is my salvation. And we find in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 21 that Matthew records that the angel had actually said that Jesus would be the one who would save his people from their sins. So think about that for just a moment and just ponder the type of king we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with a king that is in this for himself. We're not dealing with a king who is coming in all kinds of pomp and circumstance as we would normally expect. We're not dealing with a king that's wielding this gigantic sword and riding into town on a horse of glory. No, that's not the type of king this is. This is a king who comes to serve. This is a king who comes to save. This is a king who comes to show what it means to serve God and to love God and to have a heart for God. And that is who Jesus would become. That is what he would be from this point forward. The angel promises that this is the type of the person he is going to be. And we see all throughout the gospel accounts that being revealed in great detail of who Jesus was and how he was so great and why he was so great and why his reign would be so wonderful. We're getting a glimmer of it here, but we have yet to see the fullness of it. Well, let's continue with one final thought here about the nature of this throne and the nature of his reign, the nature of Jesus' reign, that is. So we mentioned, again, the throne of his father David there in verse 32. And in verse 33, how he's going to reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Now remember once more that David's throne had been unoccupied for hundreds of years. Now there had been kings that had reigned on that throne before the Babylonian captivity, but that was many years before this. That throne had been unoccupied. It had been left dormant for all that time. And in fact, God had said through Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 22 that there would be no one to reign on that throne in Judah any longer. So again, there's a sense where there is a new way this is going to be handled. And Jesus would be the one to receive that throne. He would be the one to reign on that throne. And that reign would be greater and more glorious and more enduring than even David's reign was. His reign would never come to a conclusion. It would never end. It would never have a problem like human kings do. It would never have a problem of time. It would never have a problem of endurance. It would continue and continue and continue to be the glorious and grand thing that is intended to be. So God fulfills his promise to send a king in Jesus. And we find in Jesus, just from this brief text in Luke chapter 1, the type of king he's going to be. He's coming to seek and save the lost. He's coming to help those that have been downtrodden. He's coming to help those who have been waiting for this. He's coming to be a king after God's own heart, and to be a king that will reign forever and ever over his people, who will not abandon them to their enemies, who will not hand them over to the oppressors, but who will be there to always support them and give them the things they need and make sure they're equipped for the things that they require. How glorious this king will be. And just to think we have just barely scratched the surface of the type of king he is and all that his reign would entail. But we have seen very clearly that God fulfilled his promise, and that he's in the process of fulfilling that promise according to Luke chapter 1. We have seen that as he fulfills that promise, that the king that he has sent is the greatest king the world will ever know, that there's no one before him or after him that could ever exceed his reign. And the fact that he currently reigns, the fact that he's currently enduring in that reign, the fact that he is over his people now, he is that one shepherd that is leading us, that is sustaining us, that is helping us. We have such a great king. We have so much more we want to talk about this king and his reign and what he is doing for us and how he is handling the affairs of his kingdom. But time fails us for the time being. So I'd hope that this lesson has helped you in some way to see just how great the reign of Jesus is, the promises that pertain to his kingdom and to his reign, and we'll continue this conversation next week as we continue on the same train of thought about the King of the Kingdom. Thank you again for your time.